Hi, today, this video, I'm going to be giving you a demonstration on how to glaze bisqueware with a paint-on glaze. That glaze can either be purchased commercially from a credible distributor or company, or it can be a pre-mix or a mixed glaze that you have made yourself from a recipe with the right consistency. So for us today, I have a piece of bisque cup, a slab cup. I have several glazes here, but the glazes, I have a recipe glaze. It is a white opaque glaze for my interior of my cup, and the exterior I have a turquoise slip. So to start off with, and I've spoken about this before in my other glazing videos, which is that anytime you have ceramics, it has to go through a preliminary firing. Actually, it doesn't have to, but in most practices, people bisque their work because it is easier to handle the wares, to glaze it when it is less fragile, and it's easier to apply the glaze application. So that being said, correcting myself, bisque is the first firing after it has gone through that molecular change where the omega and beta particles have exchanged and it's become the stone-like material, and the chemical water has left the clay body. It is now ready, and you can hear it when you kind of tap it, to be glazed. And in this glazing kind of process, because this is nice, this is kind of chalky, again, just like I've spoken about in previous videos, you want to take a wet, damp sponge, wring it out, and really wipe all that residual kind of dust off your pieces. So you can see that I'm kind of doing that here as I'm working, because the dust causes like a resist to the piece. Okay? So in an ideal situation, you would wax the bottom of the piece with either cold or hot wax. Today, because I'm just brushing this glaze on, I don't find it necessary because I'll be having enough control of the piece not to get glaze all over the bottom. It is very important that you get all the glaze off the bottom of your pieces, because glaze is basically a coating of glass that coats the piece to give it three things. One, strength. Once a glaze, that liquid glass, is hardened onto the piece, it makes your pots a lot stronger. Two, we do it for sanitation. The particle kind of density of the silica glass, which is inside of the glaze, is much smaller, so that when you eat or drink out of it, other than inside of like just a regular stone bisque, that it doesn't allow organic materials. Like if you were to drink orange juice out of this cup, the way that it is, you'd be fine the first time, but the second time you would drink from that cup, all of those fibers and organic materials would absorb into the pores and into the particles of the bisque, and you can't wash that out, and then bacteria and mold would grow, and then you would drink from it again. So glaze is very important in creating a sanitary surface for us to be able to use them again and again. And then last but not least, we do it for decoration. Okay? So in this process, like I said, I'm going to be using a white interior glaze. It's important to use glazes, brushes that you really have a nice full bristle that can absorb a lot of glaze while you're brushing it on. It's also important to understand that glaze is not paint. So it's not just about what you see that is important, it's about application. So when you glaze, it's important to do 2 to 3 coats of glaze, depending on what you want. And know where you have started on the piece as you work your way around. Unlike acrylic paint or with oil paints and acrylics, when you brush on those materials, when you blend, it doesn't matter how thick or thin those materials can become. Whereas with glaze, it's imperative that you're getting that dime thickness as you're working around the piece, and no more. So if you're like, well, I'm going to put 6 coats of glaze on the piece, understand that that is a bad idea. Glaze is glass for the most part. So when it melts in the kiln, and if you have too much of it, with gravity, it will come down your piece and onto the shelf and ruin not only your piece but the kiln shelf that it's sitting on, and it can become very costly, and it can also ruin the beautiful work you've made. So stay within that dime's thickness and also within the appropriate amount of coats as you start to learn your kind of practice in understanding how to glaze. Understand also glazing is just as difficult as making the work, and that in many situations, especially as a beginner, we struggle with glazing, thinking it's the worst part of the process. Try to find in your core the love of glazing, because a glaze and the way you glaze it can make or break any beautiful piece. Thirdly, I also recommend that you glaze the pieces you like the least first, so you can build an understanding, at least as a beginner, how to do this. Okay. So to start off with, I have my white glaze here, my white opaque glaze, and as I start to this starts to fill in, and do you see how it's not too drippy? It's maybe a little bit thicker, but I'm going to keep that in mind as I start to work. And you can also see here that my brush is holding quite a lot of liquid, which is really nice. So making sure that you're using a brush, a nice quality brush that can do that. So I'm kind of coming in and I'm generously applying, and you can see how over and over again I am adding more glaze as I'm working my way around. So you can see on the inside of the cup where I have added some glaze and where I have not. And because the bisque is like a sponge, it really just absorbs that moisture very quickly, I can do my first coat, which I'm almost done with, and keep track of how many times I'm reapplying my brush. And my first coat, I'm almost done here for my interior. There it is, my first coat. And as that's drying, I'm going to start to work on my exterior. And as I do that, let's see, I am going to put my hand up on the top of the piece. And so this glaze is a little bit thinner, okay, because these were made by a studio technician. Sometimes with such small quantities, the water consistencies are different, and you will also understand that also with commercial glazes. So once you get a little sense of how these work, you will know how many coats you need to do, and also if you need to add water to a glaze once it comes in from a company. Okay, so I'm using my sumi brush in this situation, I'm going to start to apply my coat, and you can see here again, I'm being very generous with my application. And I need to keep in mind, it's important not to go over the place that you just were too much, because you actually will be picking the glaze up and instead of leaving it in place. So as I'm working around, you can see it's starting to do what I want it to do. Hand on the inside. And paying attention to how many times I am again applying that glaze onto that surface, and how many times I'm dipping into my actual glaze itself. And right now, because the inside of my cup is dried a little bit, I'm able to put my hand on the inside and work my way around. So I would say that my first coat of at least the body of the piece is done, and now I just need to come in and work on that handle. So, different artists have different preferences on how to apply glaze onto their pieces. Some artists prefer brushing. Some artists prefer spraying a glaze, putting it into a spray gun and going into a spray booth, which you need a booth to do this with using proper respirators and whatnot. And then the third option would be also to dip your glazes, which is also a demonstration that I give. Okay, so as you can see already, see the chalkiness versus the darker? This is where it's already started to dry. So again, I'm now going to start to go back into the inside of the cup and do my second coat for the white interior, using my brush, coming around. And so depending on how thick your glaze is, how many coats you need to do should be determined. In this situation, I'm just going to be doing 2 coats of this opaque white glaze. I think that will be enough for it to be sound. And you also want to pay attention closely to where your glazes, especially if you're doing different colors in different areas, how they interact with each other, right? So sometimes, because glaze are not paints, when you put one glaze on top of another glaze, those 2 glazes interact with each other inside the firing process and will actually come out in its own glaze variation. So you can see here that I have that blue exterior and the white interior, but the rim has been undetermined. I still have to figure out what I'm going to do, so I'm probably going to put blue there. And because now I've done my 2 coats on the inside, I'm now going to come out again and determine where I'm going to start. So I'm going to start right near the handle and work my way over for my second coat. And the second coat should be, evening out everything, making sure everything's really well covered. If you can see any white still on your piece, that will be chalky white and will really stand out against that glassy surface. So it's really important that you cover all of your piece very generously with those 2, if not 3 coats of glaze. You can also put this on a banding wheel if you prefer, as you're working around the piece. But as this demonstration, since I'm videotaping, I'm holding it up. And then last but not least, I've done my second coat. Now I need to come in and get that rim really generously, because think about it, the rim is where we will be introducing the piece to our mouth, and we want to make sure that we're doing a good job in doing so. Because you don't want any raw glaze areas right on the edges of handles or on the edges of pieces. Okay? And then this is what I've come up with. I've allowed this dripping to kind of take place towards the inside of the form so that there'll be some glazing interactions between the form and from the interior to the exterior. See how that all comes out in the end result. So this is how you glaze with brushed work. The next thing that I need to do is to come in, make sure my hands are nice and clean, wiping my hand off, holding your piece in your clean hands, and then wiping off with your sponge any residual glaze up about 1/16 of an inch up along the side to avoid any glaze drips or pieces being rejected than being fired in the firing process. Okay, so then voila, there we are. That is how we do a paint on glaze.